There's been a lot of buzz about Final Fantasy XIV in the WoW community recently, so I decided to give it a shot, play the game for a few hours at night every day for about a week. And in this video I'm going to go over my first impressions from trying out the game from the perspective of a longtime World of Warcraft player, going through essentially the intro level stuff in Final Fantasy XIV. First off, I went into this game knowing it's very story focused, so I made sure to read all the quest texts. And I think for the first 10 levels of playing the game, I talked to more NPCs in the game than I killed monsters in the world to complete quests. There is a lot of talking. However, it also grants you a lot of experience. If I could hit level 10 in World of Warcraft by just talking to a couple of NPCs, I think I'd be fine with it. And that's kind of the case in Final Fantasy. But in World of Warcraft, that's not really how it works. The way you level up is by completing a whole bunch of quests. So if you have to talk too much to one NPC, then it just kind of feels like a waste of time because it's not really providing you any more experience than any of the other quests you're also doing. So I kind of like how fast a character can level up through this. Then when I finally did get to more combat, another big difference is the 2.5 second global cooldown. I was playing an archer character, which doesn't have a resource system or any cast times on their abilities, so it reminded me a lot of playing a Wrath of the Lich King Hunter, where you're just pushing abilities off cooldown, and then waiting for those cooldowns to finish. And since none of the abilities have a cast time, there's a lot of noticeable waiting time after pressing your one basic attack, and everything else is on cooldown. However, even with all this waiting time, they do have a lot of abilities which are off the global cooldown. And I've heard from veteran players who were basically coaching me through the game when I was streaming it, that once you hit max level, you're just gonna have a whole bunch of off cooldown abilities that you weave in between those 2.5 second global cooldowns. So it's not that big of a deal. However, at low levels, since I only hit level 17 after playing for a week, there is a lot of waiting time. Although early levels in WoW aren't fun either, so I don't really count that against the game. But the combat is definitely different. I don't think I played a very fun class for early levels, which didn't help either. There's one thing I noticed though with the off global cooldown abilities, is that some of them have their own hidden global cooldown, where it won't let you use other off global cooldown abilities until the ability finishes its casting animation. Because in World of Warcraft, if you just have a whole bunch of off global cooldown abilities, like a trinket or major cooldown, you can just macro those abilities together and use them all exactly at the same time. Now, I couldn't really figure out the macro system in Final Fantasy, but I did do some experiments where I've just tried pressing all of them at once. And they were definitely some which would go off together, and some which would definitely not because they had casting animations. Not casting times, just animations. So there is a second global cooldown for some of the off global cooldown abilities, and I guess when you look at it in the perspective of having two global cooldowns, the 2.5 second global cooldown isn't that big of a deal. Although, as a very long time WoW player who is used to the 1 second global, I definitely prefer the faster global cooldowns in World of Warcraft. A few more things about the combat before I move into the more important stuff. Pretty much all the story quests you do at early levels are ridiculously easy. There was one class quest where I was sent on basically a suicide mission where I was supposed to go into an enemy stronghold by myself to kill their leader, and in story terms, this was supposed to be difficult, but it wasn't a big deal because I could just pull the mobs one or two at a time. There was also another quest where it was obviously supposed to be a lot more difficult than everything else, because a big bad guy shows up and summons a scary looking demon, which you have to fight by yourself until help arrives. Although, I was able to just kite them around a tree and they were never able to hit me. And the mobs in the world work a little bit differently too. They have a very short leash to their spawn point, so you can't kite a mob halfway around the world like you can in WoW. But you can just kite them in circles and accomplish the same thing. In the early levels, the mobs are bunched up really close together, so you can complete the kill quest really quickly, although this comes at the cost where the mobs don't really look like they're a natural part of the world. I was told by people in my chat that this is only the case in early levels, and that later on it looks a lot more natural. But that just made me realize that WoW does a really good job of making the animals and creatures feel like they belong as part of the world. Although even early levels in WoW zones are pretty bunched up with creatures nowadays, so again, not really a mark against Final Fantasy, just another difference that stood out to me, which I was told gets a lot better later on. So, now into the actual important part of the game, the story. Final Fantasy XIV is first and foremost a story-driven game. Everything else is kinda secondary, and if you take the time to read the quest text, that's very apparent. All of the NPCs are just bursting, flavorful characters with personality and also talk in a weird way which makes them feel as more part of a fantasy world. If you want an example of this in WoW terms, remember the storyline in the Hillsbrad Foothills on the Horde side, where you meet 3 colorful characters at the beginning of the zone? Orcus, Johnny Awesome, and Dumas. Part of the thing that made those three characters memorable is because of just how outrageous they were. Orcus was a max level character doing low level content because it was easy for him, and then dies a tragic death at the end of the zone. Johnny Awesome is just a boosted player in full heirlooms who gets kidnapped and has his sparkle pony killed. And Dumas just kinda gets lost in a spider mine before getting lost somewhere else. I still remember all three of these characters because they were so out of the ordinary in World of Warcraft. They were obviously plays on player stereotypes, and they had much more memorable dialogue and personalities because of it. In Final Fantasy XIV, I found that this was kind of the norm for NPCs. A lot of work was put into all of them to make them feel more grandiose. For example, I remember one of the NPCs in Final Fantasy that I interacted with for my Archer class quest was just an insufferable snob who hated the idea of non-elves becoming an archer, and would basically berate me every time I turned in a quest. And it reminded me a lot of early Nathanos, and part of the reason he was originally a fan favorite character was because he was the only NPC that wasn't nice to your character. There was also another NPC who was just really into fungus and would go on and on about the lifestyles of different kinds of fungus in the area and how they related to the trees and ecology. They just fill out the world a lot more than in World of Warcraft, and it was kind of jarring to an extent. And as someone who actually reads a lot, as I put aside 2 hours every day to just read, it made me realize a little something about the two games when it comes to story. World of Warcraft has like the Cliff Notes version of lore. Quest text and NPC interactions are short and to the point and almost never go into detail unless that's the point of those quests, like the Hillsbrad Foothills and showing you 3 colorful personalities. Final Fantasy XIV is more like reading a book, and they go into tons of details about things which aren't necessary, but do a good job of filling out the world and the characters' personalities, even if the point of the quest is not to focus on those characters' personalities. So it's a lot more of an enjoyable time to actually read through the quests. You see, in WoW, the average player doesn't read quest text. It's a very common phenomenon that even WoW itself is aware of, so if something important is happening in a quest, the NPC will just directly read that portion of the quest text to you after you accept or turn in the quest. Or in modern WoW, if they want you to care about a colorful NPC that they've created, they'll give it custom voice lines to just tell you everything, like they did with Venari in the Maw, or with most of the major NPCs during the Covenant campaigns. And this Cliff Notes version of storytelling also applies to their cinematics as well, as none of them are longer than 5 minutes, with the majority of them being 3 minutes or less, while covering a lot of major lore information in the most summarized, one-liner dialogue way possible. Whereas contrasted to Final Fantasy, the introduction of just 2 lore characters and a random quest in the starting zone took about 8 minutes of exposition and a short cinematic between it, with only about half the introduction having voice lines. They just go into a lot more detail, and I think the story is way better for it, to the point where I kind of wish WoW would do this too. Because the actual macro story, the overall arching plot of what I experienced in the early portions of Final Fantasy XIV was actually super generic. Basically, there's some light crystals which chooses these warriors of light that are the chosen ones, and you have to appease the elemental spirits who you live on the land with. And there's these bird people who are attacking, but because they're being manipulated by some shadow dude. Nothing super intricate or unique, but I was never bored reading the story or learning about what was going to happen next, which I think is a sign of pretty good storytelling if they're able to turn something super generic into an interesting narrative. So basically, they just go into a lot more detail, and the writers are able to turn the quest text into something that's interesting because they put a lot of effort into making the characters unique. I remember someone in my chat pointing out that you learn more about the fungus and the trees and the starting zones and how they function than what Sylvanas' motivations are after 6 years of build-up. So, while nothing in the first 17 levels was especially unique, it was told very well. So when people tell me the story gets better when you get to the later expansions, I definitely believe them. So some other things I noticed. The general art style of the whole game is very anime-inspired, although since I'm a big fan of anime, that's totally fine by me. They also have a lot more pretty races than WoW, and the transmog is way more elaborate and detailed. Now, I've heard there are some other MMOs which have even more detailed models and transmog than Final Fantasy, but Final Fantasy definitely has WoW beat on that front, seeing as a majority of the Horde population is Blood Elves, and one of the most popular Alliance races is Void Elves. Even though they're one of the newest races added to the game, it's pretty apparent that World of Warcraft players also like their pretty races. So if you're just a big fan of transmog, this game might be better for you, to be honest. Traveling in the game for the first 20 levels is a lot different from WoW 2. You see, in WoW, it's possible to get a mount immediately at level 1, although from what I've heard from my chat, you have to wait until level 20 to get your first mount in Final Fantasy. So I wasn't able to get one right off the bat, but they do have a lot of teleporters where it's not a big deal. Whenever you get to a part of the zone, you can go to this blue crystal and attune to it, and then you can just teleport to the crystal by right-clicking onto your map and just paying a small fee. So it's kind of like a better flight point system, where you don't have to run to a flight point in order to use it, and there's no travel time as it just takes you to the location instantly. And they also have a Hearthstone-like system which allows you to teleport to a major crystal in a town, as long as you set your Hearthstone location there. The world is also not really open. Whenever you leave town, there's a loading screen as it takes you to a new zone, and the zones themselves aren't connected in an open world. There's a load screen in order to go to the next portion of the zone, so it's definitely not as open as the world in World of Warcraft, where there's only loading screens if you're trying to go to a new continent or an instance. So, if you enjoy the feeling of an open world, then it's not really a thing in Final Fantasy XIV. Although, I don't really care, to be honest. The open world concept is neat at first, but after a while it just kinda gets tiring having to manually run everywhere if you want to do something, as most of my interactions with WoW are just teleporting everywhere anyway. In fact, I make sure to take Shadowlands Engineering on my alt just so I can use this Shadowlands wormhole generator to teleport places faster. And Shadowlands kind of has the same system where you can't really fly to the next zones anyway, and can only get to them by teleporting or using the flight points, which are just slower than the teleporters in Final Fantasy XIV. So it seems more like a preference. On one hand, I like the feeling of a truly open world, but functionally, I definitely prefer to just teleport everywhere. Now, for some stuff I didn't get to because I only did early level stuff. From what I've heard from Final Fantasy XIV vets, raiding is perfectly fine. It's a different experience from WoW raids, but they should have challenging enough content for some of the best players. There is no Mythic Plus equivalent, however. All dungeons and raids were kind of like time walking by default, and I've also heard from pretty much everyone that PvP isn't very good. I've never tried any of these things, so I'm just going based on what my chat told me, which was full of people who were very much longtime fans of the game, so I have no reason to believe they were lying to me. But it is important to notice I never actually experienced any of these firsthand, so this is just a second-hand retelling. They also have a system for player housing and a whole zone for just minigames, which I really did want to try out, but I never got to any of those. And if I were to continue the game, it would be purely to try out those two features above everything else. Now, for the important question. Do I think you should try out Final Fantasy XIV as a World of Warcraft player? If you are staunchly against reading quest text, no matter what, then you'll probably be really bored with the early level stuff. I've heard they have a thing on their store that allows you to just get to max level, so I guess that's always an option. Although, I should say, the quest text in Final Fantasy XIV is written way better than it is in WoW, so I think it's at least worth giving it a shot, even if you're a chronic text skipper. Because I understand why you'd skip text in WoW, because most of it's very boring. I should also say, this game seems to appeal to me pretty perfectly. I'm an avid reader, MMO player, and anime enjoyer, so 3 of the biggest checkboxes of the game are perfectly suited for me. Although I vastly prefer the gameplay in World of Warcraft, and I don't really like leveling up new characters from scratch. I've done it so many times in WoW that I kind of don't find it fun in any other games anymore. And there's also a lot of combat outside of just reading after the first 10 levels, to the point where I wish I could just kind of skip the combat in Final Fantasy because I don't find the early level combat very enjoyable. Although, to be fair, early level combat in WoW isn't very fun either. And then there's the problem of buying the game. It took me 50 minutes to figure out how to just start installing the game for the first time. And that's because I had some help from someone who plays the game and was giving me hints along the way. I had heard horror stories about how buying the game was difficult beforehand, but I didn't assume it was actually this bad. And also, when I looked up a video on how to do it, the very first result was a video which gave absolutely no helpful advice at all, and had their likes and dislikes turned off because the video was terrible. Although once I watched a second or third video that had actual help information, it definitely made the process go a lot smoother. And the reason it was so difficult to install was because first you have to go to their website in order to create an account, which you can't buy the game from. So then you have to go to a different website in order to purchase the game, but they don't tell you which version of the game you need to purchase, so you just kind of have to figure that out on your own. Then if you have the launcher, they won't let you put in your information unless you have a temporary password. And in order to get the temporary password, you have to install an app, which gives you a password similar to the authenticator system in WoW. Although they won't let you set that up unless you purchase the game. I've also heard you don't need to set up a temporary password to start installing it, but I wasn't able to figure that out. And when I tried to buy the game, my credit card locked me out of being able to purchase it, which added a little bit of extra time to it. Then, after I was able to buy the correct version of the game, enter in the website to activate it so I can get a temporary password, which would allow me to activate the app, which then gave me another temporary password to log into the launcher, then I was finally able to start downloading the game. If anything, I think the biggest hurdle to playing the game would be how difficult it is to buy it. The Blizzard launcher is 10 times more convenient. With all the new players they're getting to the game, they should really think of a way to round out the user experience for just being able to purchase it. So, final thoughts for my first impressions of playing through the first 17 levels of the game. The quest texts and NPCs were miles above anything in WoW. I was told repeatedly by my chat that the early level stuff is absolute garbage, which makes me curious about the better parts of the game because I thought the intro experience was pretty good. However, I definitely prefer the WoW's 1 to 1.5 second global cooldowns. The 2.5 second global cooldown just made things a little bit too slow for my taste for early leveling.